The training station floated in the darkness between stars, a massive ring of metal and glass that housed the finest warriors from across the galaxy. Inside its main assembly hall, 300 recruits stood in neat formations, their bodies as different as the worlds they came from. Some had scales, others had fur. Some stood on 2 legs, others on 4 or 6. But they all shared one thing: they were the best their species had to offer. Commander walked between the rows with slow, measured steps. She was, which meant she stood nearly 3 meters tall with midnight black scales that reflected the station's lights. Her 4 arms moved independently as she inspected the recruits, and her yellow eyes missed nothing. She had trained soldiers for 30 years, and she knew strength when she saw it. The contingent stood particularly proud. Their species came from a world where gravity pulled harder than most, and their bodies showed it. Thick muscles wrapped around their 4-legged frames, and their 2 upper arms could bend steel bars. X, their leader, had personally crushed 17 combat records during the preliminary tests. They were nearly as impressive. They came from a heavy-gravity world near the galactic core, and evolution had given them dense bones and powerful limbs. The twins, standing at attention near the back, had both scored perfect marks in hand-to-hand combat. Then there were the humans. They stood in a small group near the eastern wall, looking almost fragile compared to the others. Their skin was soft, without scales or armor plating. Their bodies were thin by warrior standards. They came from Earth, a planet so gentle that its gravity barely registered on the standard charts. Most species in the galaxy trained under conditions that would crush a human flat, or so the rumors said. Had read the reports about Earth. It was a water world with a single moon, spinning peacefully in an unremarkable star system. Its gravity measured 9.8 meters per second squared, which was laughably weak. The pulled at 14.2. Even the standard training on this station was set to 11.5, and the humans walked around like it was nothing, but everyone assumed they were simply adapted to higher gravity after living off-world for so long. What puzzled was why the Galactic Defense Initiative had put humans in charge of gravity training. It made no sense. You didn't ask the weakest climber to teach mountain scaling. You didn't ask the slowest runner to coach sprinting. Yet here they were, and the humans had brought their own equipment. 3 enormous cylinders now stood in the station's main training bay. Each one was 20 meters across and 30 meters tall, made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Gravitational field generators covered their surfaces like mechanical barnacles, and thick cables ran from each cylinder to massive power cores beneath the floor. The humans called them training chambers, but they looked more like containment cells too. A human woman stepped forward to address the assembled recruits. She was small, barely reaching chest, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style. Her uniform identified her as Drill Instructor Sarah, and despite her size, she moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made experienced soldiers pay attention. "Good morning," said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "I'm Instructor, and I'll be running your gravity conditioning for the next 12 weeks. Behind me are 3 training chambers that simulate different gravitational environments. Every GDI operative must be able to fight effectively regardless of planetary conditions." X made a clicking sound with his mandibles, which was how laughed. Several other recruits joined in with their own species-specific expressions of amusement, waited patiently for the noise to die down. "You have a question, Recruit X?" she asked. The warrior stepped forward, his 4 legs moving in perfect coordination. "With respect, Instructor, my people train under gravity that would flatten most species. I have personally completed combat courses at 15G. What could your Earth training possibly teach us?" More laughter rippled through the assembled recruits. Even some of the more disciplined ones couldn't hide their smiles. The humans were known for many things: endurance running, pattern recognition, the ability to digest an alarming variety of foods, but physical strength wasn't on that list. His expression never changed. "That's a fair question. Earth's gravity is relatively weak compared to many worlds. We don't pretend otherwise." She turned and gestured to the first cylinder. "This chamber is set to standard Terran gravity, 1G as we call it. We'll start there." A named snorted, a sound like grinding stone. 1G, I could sleep standing in 1G. "Excellent," said. "Then you won't mind demonstrating." The challenge hung in the air. Looked at his fellow recruits, many of whom were nodding encouragement. He was young for a barely 40 standard years old, but he was strong. He had carried a disabled shuttle on his back during the rescue trials. 1G would be nothing. "I would be honored," instructor said, moving toward the chamber. Walk to a control panel beside the first cylinder. "Standard rules apply. Stay in as long as you can. Hit the emergency release if you need to exit. We'll monitor your vitals from out here." She pressed a sequence of buttons, and a door in the cylinder's side slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the chamber was empty except for a padded floor and even lighting. It looked completely ordinary, almost boring. Stepped inside confidently, his heavy footsteps making barely a sound on the padding. The door sealed behind him. For several seconds, nothing happened. Stood in the center of the chamber, arms crossed, looking back at the viewing window where the other recruits watched. His expression clearly said, "Is that all?" Then his knees buckled slightly. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a small shift in his stance like someone adjusting their balance. But then his arms uncrossed and moved out to his sides. His breathing became visible, his chest rising and falling faster than before. Sweat began to form on his rocky skin, which shouldn't have been possible. Didn't sweat easily. Leaned closer to the viewing window, her four arms folding in concentration. Something was wrong. 1G shouldn't be affecting like this. She had visited low-gravity worlds before, had even been to Earth once on a diplomatic mission. The gravity there had felt light, almost relaxing. So why did look like he was struggling? Inside the chamber, took a step forward. His foot came down wrong and he stumbled. He caught himself, but his movements looked clumsy, uncertain. This was a warrior who could cross broken terrain at full sprint, yet now he moved like a newborn learning to walk. "What's happening to him?" X asked, his earlier amusement gone. Watched the monitors calmly. "He's experiencing Earth-standard gravity for the first time." "But it's weak," one of the twins protested. "Weaker than this station, weaker than most training environments." "Yes," agreed. "It's not the strength that's the problem." 30 seconds had passed. Dropped to one knee, his breathing now labored. His hands pressed against the padded floor as if he needed to feel something solid. The other recruits watched in confused silence. This didn't make sense. Gravity was gravity. You either could handle it or you couldn't, and 1G should have been nothing for someone like. At 45 seconds, slapped his hand against the emergency release panel on the chamber wall. The door opened immediately, and he half crawled, half fell out onto the station's floor. 2 human medics rushed forward with water and a blanket, treating him like he'd just run a marathon. "I don't understand," gasped, his eyes wide. "It wasn't heavy, it was wrong, everything felt wrong." Approached, using her full height to look down at the human instructor. "Explain what just happened. That chamber nearly broke one of my best recruits, and he's trained in environments far more demanding than 1G. Met her gaze without flinching. "Commander, what's the gravity on your—" 14.2 meters per second squared, said immediately. "And it varies, doesn't it? Tidal effects from your 3 moons, geological formations, the planet's rotation. Gravity on Prime fluctuates by about 0.3 G depending on location and time of day." His eyes narrowed. "All worlds have variation, that's normal." "Exactly," said. "Every species in this room evolved on a world where gravity changes. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Your bodies expect it. Your balance systems depend on it. You make thousands of tiny adjustments every minute, compensating for variations you don't even consciously notice." She turned back to the chamber. Earth's gravity is different, it's uniform, perfectly, relentlessly uniform. Our planet has one small moon, minimal tidal effects, and a relatively smooth gravitational field. There are no meaningful variations. Gravity pulls at exactly 1 g, everywhere, all the time, without change. X was beginning to understand, and he didn't like it. So our balance systems have nothing to adjust to, finished. Your bodies are trying to compensate for variations that don't exist. It's like trying to walk on a surface you expect to be slippery, only to find it has perfect traction. Your instincts give you bad information, and your nervous system doesn't know how to handle it. Another recruit stepped forward, unnamed. Then why don't you humans have this problem? Smiled slightly. Because we evolved there. We've spent 4 billion years adapting to the most gravitationally boring planet in known space. We don't need variation to maintain balance. We do it internally, through pure neural discipline. The recruits looked at each other uneasily. Commander stared at the chamber with new respect. She had underestimated these humans badly. What had seemed like a weakness, their gentle, was actually something else entirely. "Who's next?" asked, looking around at the assembled warriors. Nobody volunteered immediately. The laughter from before had died completely. Even X, who had mocked the exercise earlier, looked uncertain now. Finally, Commander straightened all 4 of her arms. "I will go." Nodded. "As you wish, Commander. Same rules apply." Entered the chamber with deliberate calm, determined to show better control than. The door sealed and the uniform gravity engaged. For exactly 3 seconds she felt fine. Then her world tilted. It wasn't the gravity itself. She had trained in lower gravity many times, but this was different. Her inner ear was screaming that something was wrong. Her body kept trying to adjust to fluctuations that weren't there, making corrections that threw her further off balance. She took a step and nearly fell. Her 4 arms spread wide, searching for equilibrium that refused to come. The worst part was the psychological effect. Every instinct told her she was falling, even though she was standing still. Her species had evolved in caves with varying gravity wells, where reading gravitational changes meant the difference between finding safe passage and falling into an abyss. Those ancient instincts, normally so reliable, were now actively working against her. She lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds before she had to leave. It was one of the hardest minutes of her life. As she exited, breathing hard, she saw 3 human instructors inside the chamber performing warm-up exercises. They jogged in place, did jumping jacks, and moved through combat forms with easy grace. What had nearly broken her was their normal. The afternoon sessions continued, with recruit after recruit attempting the chamber. Some lasted 30 seconds. A few managed 2 minutes. One particularly determined named made it to 3 minutes and 12 seconds before his legs gave out entirely. Meanwhile, the human instructors moved through the chamber like it was empty air. They ran obstacle courses. They practiced weapons drills. One human, a massive man named Tors, did handstand push-ups in the corner while chatting casually with about dinner plans. By evening, every recruit understood. The humans weren't weak. They were different. They had adapted to an environment so unusual that it gave them abilities no other species possessed. They could function in conditions that triggered complete disorientation in everyone else. As the recruits filed out of the training bay, exhausted and humbled, called after them. "Tomorrow we'll try Chamber 2. That one's set to 1.5 G, still uniform, still perfectly boring Earth-style gravity." X paused at the door, and the 3rd chamber. 2G said, "That's where we train our Special Forces operators." The warrior looked back at the cylinders with something approaching awe. "Your species weaponized boredom." Smile was small but genuine. "We had 4 billion years to practice. Sleep well, recruits. Tomorrow's going to be harder." As the doors closed and the lights dimmed, the 3 chambers stood silent in the training bay. They didn't look impressive. They didn't need to. Inside them was something more challenging than crushing gravity or exotic environments. Inside them was the perfectly uniform pull of Earth, unchanged and unchanging, the most disorienting force in the galaxy. The alien recruits had learned their first real lesson. Sometimes the strangest environment is the most normal one. 3 weeks had passed since that first disastrous day in the gravity chambers. The training station continued its endless orbit, but inside its walls, something had changed. The alien recruits no longer laughed at human instructors. They no longer made jokes about Earth's gentle gravity. Instead, they approached the chambers with the kind of serious respect usually reserved for actual combat. X had become obsessed with mastering uniform gravity. Every morning, he was first in line at Chamber 1, and every morning he lasted a little longer than the day before. His personal record now stood at 7 minutes and 32 seconds, which was impressive for a but still far short of what the humans could do. Commander watched from the observation deck as X ran through his morning attempt. The warrior stood in the center of the chamber, all 4 legs spread wide for balance, concentrating intensely on simply remaining upright. Sweat poured down his carapace despite the comfortable temperature. His mandibles clicked in rhythm, a meditation technique his species used to maintain focus. At 7 minutes and 40 seconds, his rear left leg buckled. He caught himself, but the damage was done. Once you started falling in uniform gravity, your instincts kicked in with compensations that made everything worse. X had learned that lesson painfully over the past 3 weeks. He slapped the emergency release and exited the chamber, breathing hard but with a determined expression. "Better," instructor said, making a note on her data pad. "You're learning to quiet your instincts. That's the key." "How long did it take you to master this?" X asked. Considered the question. "I grew up in it, so for me, it was normal from birth. But trained adults coming from variable gravity stations. Usually about 6 months to feel comfortable, a year to achieve real proficiency." "A year," X repeated, his mandibles clicking in dismay. "We have 12 weeks." "You won't master it," agreed. "But you'll learn to function in it, which is what matters for GDI operations." Other recruits had begun arriving for morning training. The twins approached Chamber 2 with visible reluctance. That chamber was set to 1.5 G, still perfectly uniform, and it was significantly harder than the first. The increased gravity made the disorientation worse somehow, as if the added weight gave your failing instincts more to work with. Descended from the observation deck to the main floor. She had her own session scheduled in Chamber 2, and she'd been preparing mentally for the past hour. The trick, she'd learned, was to convince your body that nothing was wrong. You had to ignore centuries of evolutionary programming and simply trust that the ground would stay level, that gravity would pull consistently, that everything was exactly as boring as it seemed. It was harder than any combat she'd experienced. As she approached the chamber, one of the human instructors, a young man named Davis, greeted her. "Morning, Commander. Ready for today's session?" "As ready as I can be," admitted, "though I suspect I'll never truly be ready for your planet's bizarre gravity." Davis laughed. "You're doing better than most. Some species can't adapt at all. For example, they pulled their entire contingent from training last week. Their biology just couldn't handle the uniform field." Had heard about that. There were species with incredibly sophisticated balance organs that allowed them to walk on walls and ceilings. But those same organs made them completely helpless in uniform gravity. They'd leave the chambers disoriented for hours, unable to determine which way was up. "Different species, different challenges," said, which was about as diplomatic as she got. She entered Chamber 2 and immediately felt the increased pull. 1.5 G wasn't much by her standards. The pulled harder than this, but combined with the lack of variation, it was like standing in a sensory deprivation tank. Her body screamed that she was falling, drowning, floating, anything except standing safely on solid ground. focused on her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, counting slowly. She had learned this from the human instructors. Humans did this thing called meditation, where they focused on their breathing to quiet their minds. It seemed simple, almost childish, but it helped in the chambers. She managed 5 minutes before the nausea became too intense. Better than her first attempt at 1.5 G, which had lasted barely 90 seconds. As she exited, she saw instructor working with a small group of recruits in the far corner of the training bay. They weren't using the chambers. Instead, they were doing some kind of exercise on the regular station floor, which was set to the standard 11.5 G that most species found comfortable. Curious approached, had the recruits standing perfectly still with their eyes closed. "Feel the variation," was saying. "The station's gravity isn't perfectly uniform. There are fluctuations from the rotation, from the mass distribution in the ring. Your bodies are detecting those changes right now, making tiny adjustments. That's normal for you. That's comfortable." The recruit stood quietly, apparently concentrating on something couldn't perceive. "Now," continued, "try to imagine what it would feel like if those variations stopped, if gravity pulled exactly the same from every direction at every moment. Not heavier, not lighter, just the same." One of the recruits, a female named, opened her eyes with a disturbed expression. "I can't. It feels wrong just to think about it." "Exactly," said. "That's what you're fighting in the chambers. Not the gravity itself, but the absence of variation. Your minds can't accept it as normal." Stepped closer. "How do you train someone to accept something their mind rejects?" Looked up at the commander. Slowly, repetitively, the same way you train any difficult skill. "But I won't lie to you, Commander. Some people never fully adapt. The best we can do is teach you to push through the disorientation long enough to complete a mission." "Is that enough?" asked. "It has to be," replied. "Because there are environments out there where uniform gravity is the reality. Deep space stations, artificial habitats, certain types of dead worlds. The galaxy is a big place and not all of it follows comfortable rules." The morning sessions continued. More recruits attempted the chambers, each one showing gradual improvement but still falling far short of human performance. By midday, even the most determined warriors looked exhausted. Lunch was served in the station's main cafeteria, a huge space where recruits from different species gathered at specialized tables. They ate at stations with elevated platforms. They required a different atmospheric mix, so they dined in sealed sections. The humans ate at normal tables, their meals looking almost boring compared to the exotic requirements of other species. X found himself sitting near a group of human instructors. Over the past 3 weeks, he developed something approaching respect for these small, soft-skinned warriors. They might not be the strongest or fastest, but they had something else. An ability to function in conditions that broke everyone else. "Can I ask you something?" X said to instructor Tors, the large human who'd been doing handstand push-ups that first day. "Sure," Tors replied, not looking up from his meal. "Why does your species train in higher gravity? You showed us Chamber 3 is set to 2G, that's higher than Earth's natural gravity. Why push beyond what you evolved for?" Tors smiled. "Because we might need to fight on your world someday. If the GDI deploys us to Prime or a colony, we need to be ready. We can't match your natural strength in high gravity, but we can at least function." "And you can do this, function at 2G. "Special forces can," Tors said. "Regular infantry trains up to 1.5. It's hard, don't get me wrong. 2G feels like walking through mud while someone sits on your chest. But humans have this stubborn thing where we refuse to accept limitations." X clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "Your species is strange." "Yeah, we get that a lot." That afternoon brought the first integrated combat drills. Instead of just standing in the chambers, recruits would now have to move, fight, and complete objectives while dealing with uniform gravity. Commander divided everyone into mixed species teams and set up obstacle courses inside each chamber. The first team to attempt Chamber 1 included X2 and one human instructor named Riley. Their objective was simple: cross the chamber, retrieve a flag from the far wall, and return to the start. Time limit: 5 minutes. The non-human struggled immediately. X tried to run and found himself lurching like a drunk. They moved in slow, careful steps, their usual grace completely gone. They simply gave up on bipedal movement and crawled, which worked better but was still painfully slow. Meanwhile, Riley jogged normally, retrieved the flag in about 30 seconds and jogged back. He wasn't even breathing hard. "That's not fair," one of them protested. "Combat isn't fair," replied from outside the chamber. "Next team." Team after team attempted the drill. The pattern was always the same. Alien recruits struggled and stumbled while human instructors moved normally. It was humbling for warriors who were used to being the strongest in any room. But slowly, very slowly, the alien recruits improved. By the 20th attempt, X managed to cross the chamber without falling. His movements were clumsy and he took twice as long as Riley, but he did it. The other recruits cheered when he made it back with the flag. "Better," said, making notes. "You're starting to trust your footing." Evening brought a surprise. The human instructors set up a demonstration in Chamber 3, the 2G chamber that none of the alien recruits had even attempted yet. The entire training cohort gathered at the viewing windows to watch. 3 humans entered the chamber, Tors and a third instructor named Park. Once the door sealed and the gravity engaged, they began a full combat demonstration. They moved through martial arts forms, practiced weapons drills with training sticks, and even sparred with each other. Their movements were slower than normal, more deliberate, but they maintained complete control. Watched in silence, these humans were fighting in conditions that would drop her to her knees. 2G with perfect uniformity. It was absurd. It was impossible, but they were doing it anyway. "How long can they maintain that?" she asked the assistant instructor monitoring the session. "Hours if needed," the assistant replied. "Special Forces operators train at 2G for 6-hour shifts. It's part of their standard certification." 6 hours, repeated quietly. Inside the chamber, Tors performed a spinning kick that would have been impressive at any gravity. At 2G, it was poetry. He moved like gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. When the demonstration ended and the 3 instructors exited the chamber, the assembled alien recruits did something that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. They applauded. Not mockingly, not condescendingly, but with genuine respect. Accepted the applause with a simple nod. "You all have the evening off. Tomorrow we start multi-gravity scenarios where we'll be switching between different fields mid-exercise. Rest well." As the recruits dispersed, X approached one more time. "I owe you an apology, instructor. When we first arrived, I thought your training would be useless. I was wrong." Smiled. "Apology accepted, recruit, but you weren't entirely wrong. This training isn't useful for most situations. 90% of the galaxy has variable gravity. This is specialty training for unusual circumstances." "But those circumstances exist," X said. "Yes," agreed. "They exist, and when you encounter them, you'll need to know how to function. That's what we're teaching you." X looked back at the 3 chambers standing silent in the training bay. "Your species doesn't have our strength. You don't have our speed or our natural advantages, but you have this: the ability to fight in conditions that break everyone else." "Every species has something," said. "Have 4 arms and incredible durability. Have superior reflexes and natural armor. Have raw strength. And humans, we have adaptability. We can function in the most gravitationally boring environment in the galaxy, and we learn to use that as a weapon." That night, as prepared her daily report to GDI Command, she added a personal note. The human training program was succeeding beyond expectations. The recruits were learning to handle uniform gravity, and more importantly, they were learning to respect humans as warriors. Earth's gravity was weak. That was a fact, but weakness wasn't the same as uselessness. Sometimes the gentlest environment produced the most adaptable species. She approved the next phase of training and closed her report. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but the recruits were ready. They had learned the first and most important lesson of the GDI. Strength comes in many forms. 6 weeks had passed since training began, and the atmosphere in the station had transformed completely. What started as mockery had evolved into focused determination, then grudging respect, and finally genuine cooperation. The alien recruits still couldn't match human performance in the uniform gravity chambers, but they had improved dramatically from those first disastrous attempts. Commander now managed 10 minutes in Chamber 2 before the disorientation became overwhelming. X could complete basic combat drills in Chamber 1, though his movements remained stiff and uncertain. The twins had developed a technique of moving in perfect synchronization, using each other as reference points to maintain balance. Even the, who had struggled most with the psychological effects, could now function well enough to complete simple objectives. But today was different. Today brought the first full combat simulation, and everyone knew it would be the real test of their training. The scenario briefing took place in the main operations room. Instructor stood before a holographic display showing a detailed planetary model. The planet looked dead, with a gray surface marked by countless impact craters and no visible atmosphere. "This is Terminus 7, explained. "A mining colony on the edge of GDI space. 3 days ago, contact was lost. Last transmission indicated hostile forces had taken control of the main facility and were holding 73 civilian workers hostage. Your mission is to infiltrate the facility, neutralize the hostiles, and extract the civilians." The hologram zoomed in on a cluster of buildings nestled in a large crater. Defensive positions were marked in red, potential entry points in green, and civilian locations in blue. "What's the gravity on Terminus 7? Asked a named. 1.2 G, perfectly uniform, replied. "Terminus 7 is a dead world with minimal rotation and no moons. Its gravitational field has almost no variation." The room fell silent. Every recruit understood what that meant. This wasn't just a combat test. It was a gravity test under combat conditions. Continued. "You'll be divided into 2 teams. Alpha Team will be led by Commander and will include 6 alien recruits. Bravo Team will be led by myself and will include 6 human instructors. Both teams will run the same scenario independently, and your performance will be evaluated." X shifted in his seat. "Will we be in actual chambers?" "Yes, we've programmed Chamber 1 to simulate the facility's interior. Full tactical gear, training weapons with stun settings, and holographic enemies with adaptive AI. It will feel real because it needs to be real." Studied the facility layout. She had led dozens of actual combat missions during her career, but this felt different. On a real mission, you worked within your natural capabilities. Here, they would be fighting against their own instincts, struggling with every step while trying to maintain tactical awareness. "When do we start?" she asked. "Alpha Team deploys in 1 hour. Bravo Team will run the scenario tomorrow so you can watch their approach." Questions. There were many questions, mostly tactical. What weapons would the enemies have? How many hostiles? What were the rules of engagement? Answered each one patiently, and slowly the recruits began to shift from nervous anticipation to focused preparation. 60 minutes later, Alpha Team gathered outside Chamber 1 wearing full tactical gear. Checked her weapon, a training rifle that fired stun rounds, and looked over her squad. She had chosen carefully, X for his determination, and another named for their strength, the twins for their coordination, and a warrior named who had shown remarkable adaptability in training. They were good soldiers, but could they fight effectively while their bodies screamed that they were falling? "Remember your training," said quietly. "Trust your footing. Ignore your instincts. The gravity won't change no matter how wrong it feels." The chamber door opened. Inside, the holographic simulation had transformed the empty space into a perfect recreation of Terminus 7's main facility. Corridors stretched in multiple directions, lit by dim emergency lights. Distant sounds of machinery echoed through the space. It looked real, felt real, and that made it dangerous. Alpha Team entered. The door sealed behind them, the uniform gravity engaged. Immediately felt the familiar wrongness. Her balance systems began their futile search for variations that didn't exist. She pushed through it, focusing on the mission. X, take point, twins on flanks, and rear guard move out. They advanced down the main corridor in standard tactical formation. Or they tried to. X moved too slowly, his steps kept drifting to the left, his instincts telling him the floor was tilted when it wasn't. The twins did better, using each other as anchors, but even they moved with obvious difficulty. In the observation room, dozens of instructors and off-duty recruits watched the mission unfold on multiple screens. The contrast was stark. Alpha Team moved like they were drugged, stumbling through what should have been simple maneuvers. The first contact came at the 3-minute mark. 4 holographic enemies appeared from a side corridor, weapons raised. Training dictated that Alpha Team should take cover and return fire, basic stuff that every soldier learned in their first week. But in uniform gravity, nothing was basic. X tried to dive behind a cargo container and misjudged the distance. He hit the cover too hard, bouncing back and exposing himself to enemy fire. A stun round caught him in the chest. Simulation rules meant he was now tagged as wounded, reducing his mobility by 50%. Managed to get behind cover and return fire, but his aim was off. The lack of gravitational variation meant he couldn't predict his weapon's recoil properly. His shots went wide. The twins worked together, one firing while the other spotted, and they managed to take down 2 enemies. But the remaining 2 had them pinned. "Flank right," ordered, moving to support the twins. She forced herself to run, fighting every instinct that told her she was falling. Her 4 arms felt uncoordinated, heavy in ways they never were at higher gravity. Tried to execute the flanking maneuver but lost his balance mid-movement. He went down hard, and the simulation tagged him as wounded. It took Alpha Team 4 minutes to clear that first contact. In normal gravity, it should have taken 30 seconds. "Regroup," commanded, breathing harder than she liked. They had barely started, and already the uniform gravity was taking its toll. Her squad looked exhausted. They pushed deeper into the facility. The second contact went slightly better. The team had found a rhythm, accepting that their movements would be slow and awkward. But slow and awkward doesn't win firefights. 2 more team members got tagged as wounded before they cleared the enemy position. The mission objective was still 2 corridors away, and they had already lost 50% combat effectiveness. Made a command decision. "Twins, you're on extraction. Everyone else, we push for the hostages. Move." What followed was brutal. Every corridor felt like a marathon. Every firefight took twice as long as it should. Alpha Team fought with courage and determination, but the uniform gravity was a constant enemy they couldn't overcome. They reached the hostage location after 19 minutes, far exceeding the recommended time limit. The final room contained 6 holographic civilians and 8 enemies in defensive positions. It was a nightmare scenario even in normal conditions. In uniform gravity, it was almost impossible.